So you missed out on the ancient hall at Trinity, which is under refurbishment at the moment. But I'm pretty sure that would have been absolutely boiling today. So you had a less charismatic building, but at least it was cool. So welcome back. We're going to talk about power sector transformations and net zero. I've got 4 panelists. We have one change, but I'll explain that in a second. So we have Karina Litvak, who is dialing in from the airport, actually, and you'll see Karina in just a second. There you go. Hi, Karina, who is a NED at Eni. We have Mattia Romani, who's a partner at Systemic. We have my colleague, Professor Nick Eyre, who is co-director of the Zero Institute and a professor of energy and climate policy here at Oxford. And then Nick Tracy, who is director Net Zero Advisory at Beringer Partners. Nick has stepped up to replace Tony Rook, who unfortunately couldn't make it today. So I've asked each of them to kind of give 5-6 minutes of opening remarks. And then we're going to open it up and have a very vibrant discussion like we've had with the other sessions. But Karina, you are about to board a plane, and I think we're on the clock. So thank you so much. If you could introduce yourself, and a question for you. Could you say a bit about how Eni is approaching the net zero carbon transition and some of the challenges you have as a large incumbent specifically?
Sure. First of all, can you hear me okay if I keep my mask on, or is it better if I remove it like this?
It's a bit better if it's removed.
Okay, fine. So I'll take it off. I'm the only freak in this airport that's masked anyway, so fine. So thank you very much for having me today. My name is Karina Litvak. I've been on the board of Eni, otherwise known as ENI, the Italian oil and gas major, for 8 years. So I'm just entering my 9th and final year. Eni has been very, very much engaged in the climate transition, and this is something that kind of unfolded behind the scenes for 6 years, and then in February of 2020 we went public with our what we call our strategic pivot. It really is a very radical swing away from being a traditional multi-sector oil and gas. So by that I mean that we're in oil and gas, but we're also in trading, refining, electricity, petrochemicals, and all of that is switching across to a shift. In the first instance, the upstream oil and gas business is essentially shifting away from a model of investing in very large, long-lived extraction assets towards a model that is much more about maximizing cash generation in small, near-field, short-lived, very rapid payback projects that generate, significant volumes of cash, but are themselves quite small projects, so very high IRRs, but very, very high cash returns, all of which are then shifted across to fund the new businesses being renewables, so solar and wind, but also some other technologies such as wave, a very, very big push into biorefining. And by biorefining, I refer to second and third generation feedstocks. We've just announced yesterday the opening of our first biorefinery outside of Italy or even Europe. It's in Kenya, and it's going to be supplied by locally grown oil seeds that grow on degraded land. So it's all part of an integrated approach to soil regeneration. So really a major shift into agricultural feedstocks as a substitute for oil and gas. The mobility business, which is the old network of petrol fueling stations, is being switched over to supplying a range of alternative fuels as well as electrical charging. We've also grown in the in building a network of charge points outside of service stations. So big push into supplying EVs. The chemicals business is moving into biochemicals and recycled chemicals. And what does that leave? Electricity, which is being spun out into a separate company that we will nevertheless still control 75-80%. But will be by 2040, 100% zero or net zero energy generation. So a combination of solar and wind, biogas, as well as other types of power generation, and also demand management technologies and so forth. So the entire package is about using the technologies, the skills, and the capital that we have towards essentially funding and enabling the growth of a completely new business. So that, in a nutshell, is what the board has driven and enabled. And my role coming into this, I guess I should have said at the very beginning, is I was nominated by the institutional investors, very much with a view to bringing a kind of sustainable investment and governance expertise, as well as a non-Italian perspective. I was the first ever non-Italian member on that board. I've now been joined by one other who joined us 2 years ago, who's Belgian. But historically, the board had been 100% Italian, whereas our geographic footprint as a company is overwhelmingly non-Italian. So it was a nice thing to do, to internationalize the board and bring a perspective that is very plugged into the international investor community. So that's it.
Great. Thanks so much, Karina. And I'm going to ask you two follow-up questions because I know you can only join us for a bit longer. So, and you sort of were starting to allude to this in what you were saying before. Can you hear us? We lost you? Don't know. Okay, we might have lost Karina. Well, I guess when she gets back, I'll ask her a question. Mattia, do you want to go next?
Sure.
Sorry.
I am Italian, but I don't sit on the board of any. So.
One day soon, I'm sure.
Yes, not yet. Who knows? Hello, Mattia Romani. I'm a partner at Systemic, which is an advisory plus firm on sustainability and climate. So I want to talk about three things. I want to talk about what motivates us at Systemic, why we're interested in the power sector. Second thing, I want to talk about what it means for finance and what kind of actions do we see need to happen in the finance sector, we expect to happen in the finance sector. And I'm going to say a word or two of why now. And I'm trying to do that in how many? 5 minutes? Yep, I've already just used one for this. So we're fundamentally interested in this because of cost curves. And it is really what drives us, because we believe that cost curves determine the fundamental shifts in the economy. And we are very familiar with some cost curves. You know, in the last 10 years, solar panels cost have come down 85%. Wind manufacturing costs have come down 55%. Very good friends of Oxford's, I'm sure, at INET tell us that these trends are going to continue. So we're not at the end of this cost curve story for renewables. On top of that, we have, of course, the cost curves for storage. But it's not only the implication of this particular cost curves that interest us, but it is how they interact with other cost curves as well. I'm going to say a word or two on this in a moment. But fundamentally, we believe that the implications of these cost curves are that in the next 10, 15 years, in several locations in the world, power will be basically zero marginal cost. And in fact, it may be close to zero average cost as well, as some of the CapEx investments that are needed up front are amortized. So what interests us, and this is why I want to talk about other cost curves as well, what interests us about the power sector is to try to answer the question, what does a world with free power look like? How does free, zero emissions power impact the rest of the economy? Now, before you start trying to answer that question, which is a difficult question to answer, there's other cost curves that we're observing are coming down the same S-shaped curve. AI, artificial intelligence cost curves. AI is becoming cheaper and cheaper thanks to the reductions in the cost of computation. Costs of genomics are coming down very quickly. Why am I mentioning this too? Because the combination of free power and cheaper genomics implies that things like alternative proteins can be produced at scale at very, very low cost. The combination of AI and superchip power means that autonomous driving will become incredibly cheap and very quickly. Well, the point I'm trying to make is that power is particularly interesting because it really underpins a number of transformations which are really, really deep, and they require real system thinking to be understood. And by the way, even at a company called Systemic, we don't claim that the system thinking is fully understandable and mappable. But what we can see is that the opportunities for investors are really enormous, and there are opportunities about rethinking everything. I'm sorry to use the logo, but it is really about rethinking everything. It's about profounding changes in the economy as we know it. One example I often use is food systems. I was talking to somebody at lunch. If indeed you believe that genomics plus free power means very cheap alternative proteins, you may not think that your beautiful steak is going to be produced through alternative proteins, but you probably can manage to think that your pet food will be done with alternative proteins. So some processed meat will be done with alternative proteins. Now, this will impact the cattle market significantly, the poultry market significantly. These are both markets which are on the brink of bankruptcy already today. So the implications, so even a small amount of demand from these markets being shifted to alternative proteins could be substantial. On land use, for example, a lot of the land in the world, about half of the land in the world is used to grow crops, which are then used to feed animals. So what does it mean for food, for land use and land value? So you can see how quickly we start from power, but power really underpins so many other transformations which are quite deep. So that's why we're interested in. Okay, why finance? What actions? What does it mean for finance? I want to bring us back to Earth after this, having told you that the world is never going to look like this again. It's going to all change. What does it mean for finance today? Well, the first thing is that sort of finance needs to be better at thinking about an exponentially changing future. Finance tends to be very linear in the way in which it changes, it thinks about the future, and it really has to shift gear to think about exponential changes because of the S-nature shape of cost curves. And let me be very practical on this. I spent the last 2 years working for a hedge fund, and I spent every day, first thing you do, you get in the office, open up Bloomberg, and you look up a company to figure out whether you think the company is baking in revenue projections that are in line with your exponential view of the world. And you think, okay, well, let's see what this company thinks about revenues in 2020, in 2023, 2024, 2025. Now, 2023 or 2024, you'll find a consensus projection from analysts on revenues. 2025 is a blank box. There's no consensus projection in 2025. They don't think about 2025. Equity analysts mostly do not think about 2025. But if you are facing exponential change in the demand in that particular sector, they ought to. And I think the first point I want to make about finance is that it's essential that the finance sector start thinking about the future in an exponential way. And this is very much the work that we are trying to support at Systemic. The second thing is that I wanted to mention in terms of actions for finance. A lot of the story I tell you, you will say, Mattia, I don't know what you're on. Didn't you see the bottlenecks that are that we are experiencing in this market, including renewable markets, solar and wind, have met bottlenecks. You will have read about renewable inflation with wind prices going up because of some bottlenecks in the supply chain on the wind side. So I think one important action that finance needs to take is identify future bottlenecks and be ready to invest in them. Because not only this is good for the transition, but actually it's good business. Because if you're early on a bottlenecks, that by definition means that you're going to do some good business in the area. So one other action I have, the second, is around identify future bottlenecks and be ready to invest in them. And the third and last action I would have for finance, and this is particularly related to emerging markets, is to think more smartly about leveraging public money. And this is about blended finance. I know as soon as we say blended finance, everybody falls slightly asleep and a post-lunch talk. But actually, there is a lot of important work that public money can do in de-risking where it's needed markets where otherwise we won't see the speed of change we want to see. And here, having spent six years of my life working for an international organization, EBRD, I can tell you that those balance sheets can be stretched much more innovatively. So it's a bit boring, but it needs to be done. So it's the third action that I would say finance needs to take. Now, I'll finish on saying why now, because again, you can see, oh, Mattia, all nice and good, but didn't you look around yourself? Inflation, increasing interest rate, fears of a recession, an economy which is bizarrely in full employment, so there's a real problem finding skilled labor. All of the stuff you're talking about is not relevant in this macroeconomic environment. And I'm making this point particularly because in the finance context, this is a pushback I get a lot. And here, I think we have to turn the story around and tell financial market why this is relevant now. We're talking about financing technologies which are going to give us cheaper, more productive, lower emissions, and lower local pollution, goods and services, but especially cheaper and more productive. This is a story about productivity and deflation in an inflationary moment. So that's why I think it's a timely moment to tell the story about the transition to a low-carbon economy.
Great, thank you so much for that. And lots of themes we'll pick up, including on emerging markets. So Nick, over to you. You lead a lot of our work on the power sector here at Oxford. So.
Yeah, thanks. I'm going to say...
Sorry, the other Nick.
Oh, please do, sorry.
Unless you lead a lot of this work here at Oxford. You're lost.
Words. Thanks, Ben. It's great to be here. Just a quick word about the Zero Institute, because many of you will be confused by the multiplicity of relevant institutes in this university. People within the university are certainly. So the Zero Institute we launched only a couple of months ago. It stands for Zero Carbon Energy Research Oxford. So it actually will do what it says on the tin. We are in Oxford, it will do research, and it will be on zero carbon energy. That's about as much as I can tell you at the moment without going into much more detail, which I don't want to spend time doing that. If anybody wants to talk to me, I'll be here for the rest of the day. I'm really happy to talk to you in more detail about what we're going to do in the Institute. Other than that, I should start with an apology. I mean, Ben knows this, so I don't know why he invited me. I know very, very little about finance. I'm glad the rest of the panel do. So what I want to talk about really is building on what Matteo has said, talking about changes in the energy system and the electricity system with a focus on that word system. And the three things I'm going to tell you are that electricity is important, that it's complex, and that has implications for investment, which are probably things that you already knew, but I think it's useful to try to spell them out. So electricity is important for at least three reasons. One is it's a major source of greenhouse gases, particularly coal, as Claire Perry reminded us this morning. Secondly, and crucially, I think it's relatively easy to decarbonise for the reasons that Matteo has explained. The cost structure in the industry has changed and is going to go on changing. And that means that actually it's central to a wider set of decarbonisation problems. We heard this morning in the context of shipping about hydrogen, ammonia. Those are largely contingent on green hydrogen, i.e. expanded electricity, and decarbonisation of land-based transport, decarbonisation of heat are probably also dependent on electrification. So we not only need to decarbonise electricity, we need to expand its use in the economy to displace fossil fuels. That's why it's critically important. It's complex because it's not, I don't think of electricity as a sector. I think of it as a system for which policymakers have multiple goals. Climate mitigation is one, but anybody who's been awake and in Europe for the last year will realise that affordability and security are also critically important for the system. And let's not forget that 1 billion people on this planet don't have access to electricity, and for policymakers in the countries that they live in, that's the most important policy challenge. There's three. I'm going to talk about there being three subsectors. One is generation, which Matteo's talked about, but there's also a whole sector of use of electricity, particularly these new uses of electricity that I've mentioned, and then a whole sector in transmission, distribution, and storage. And these turn out to be important for investment, as I'll say in a minute. There's then, I think, three challenges. One is decarbonising electricity supply. The second is expanding electricity supply to these new sectors. And the third is balancing electricity supply and demand, because quite annoyingly, solar and wind are variable in nature, and therefore expanding their use makes balancing the system more problematic. Could I just have my first and one and only slide? So it's not my only one and only slide, but it's the most unsophisticated slide that you will see all day. It is basically a back of the envelope calculation. I'm sure many people in this room have much better calculations of what's the total investment needed to undertake the power sector transition, but this is basically from my back of envelope at the weekend. What it lacks in sophistication, it benefits in transparency, because what I've done is estimate the physical amount of stuff we need for the low carbon transition, estimate what its unit price is from the literature, and then do a multiplication sum to give you the final column. So if you don't like any of the numbers in the first two columns, you could just change them and change the number at the end. And the total... So I get three insights from this table, which I would like to share with you. The first is that the total investment required is quite large. 23 trillion, even if the number's wrong by a factor of 2, is quite a large number. But it's not unimaginably large. The International Energy Agency tell us that global energy sector investment is about 2 trillion a year. So this is 10 years worth of investment, and for the reasons that Matteo set out, if we'd been sitting here 10 years ago with these numbers, they would have been much bigger than they are now. So it would seem like a tractable problem. The second point is that it's not just a generation problem. Yeah, we will need a lot of wind and solar, and that's trillions in each. But EV batteries, heat pumps, electrolyzers, also of order $1 trillion investment is needed to get those to where we need to be to decarbonise the global economy. And that's the third insight then, is that these are very different types of investment, and the rest of the panel can tell you why that might matter much better than I can. But in a sense, it's obvious that a large wind farm is, say, of order a gigawatt, so we need a few thousand of those globally. But the number of EV batteries that we need globally, we might make in a few factories, but the number of individual investments in vehicles that will be made will be counted in the trillion, in the billions. So it's billions of order $1,000 investment rather than a few $1 billion investment. And it seems to me that's an important thing to take note of. I've spent most of my career working on energy demand and energy efficiency, on precisely those sorts of highly distributed, quite small scale investments, trying to understand why they don't happen rationally in many cases. So I think my final message for you as an audience interested in finance is, yeah, finance is going to be really important in this challenge, but please don't think it's the only one, because particularly for these distributed investments, questions of policy, social questions about how resources are distributed, why people will purchase or not purchase things, and these things are often seen as purchases rather than investments, and I think that's an important distinction. So it's a technology problem, it's a social problem, it's a policy problem, as well as a finance problem, and that's why the thinking of it as a system that needs to change is really important. I'll leave it there, Ben.
Great, thanks so much, Nick. So, other Nick.
The other Nick.
Thank you for stepping up at short notice to take Tony's place. You've complete freedom to take it off in all sorts of different directions. Would be good, maybe at some point in those remarks, if you could say something about things like the Net Zero Banking Alliance, the Net Zero Asset Owners Alliance, Paris-aligned investment initiative, all these things that have sometimes been referenced in the conversation. Power is the first sector that those alliances have really done in-depth work on, and what does that mean? And also, does it shed any light on some of the other sectoral conversations we're having in the direction of travel? Over to you.
I feel I'm in good company here because I think, Nick, you said that you weren't a finance expert, and I'm by no means a power sector expert. So the part that I've got covered, hopefully between us, is talking about what banks are doing in this space. So I'm at Baringa Partners, and we've been working with a lot of banks on their net zero strategies. And banks are all, at this stage, most of them joining the Net Zero Banking Alliance, where the first thing that they need to tackle is the power sector. Because, and to your point, the power sector is essentially the key to then unlocking the decarbonisation in a lot of those other sectors. So hopefully, I think between the three of us on the panel, we can, and any others, we can cover how finance then supports the power generation sector. What we tend to do in banks is we look at the power sector. The first question we're asking is, how will the power sector decarbonise? What pathways does the power sector need to follow? And what are the technologies required to unlock decarbonisation? The question then for banks is really a decision between primarily two factors. How much do they invest in and support the lending in those new renewable technologies versus continuing to support their existing customers that are generating power from fossil fuels? And so your portfolio optimization question and essentially achieving that decarbonisation pathway is that balance of investing and engaging with your existing clients.
Good stuff. Okay. Sorry, I was taking notes for questions I was going to ask you. That was to the point. Okay, so I do have a few questions I'm going to ask. And whilst I ask the first one, please think about what you might want to ask the panel. So question number one, some people asked me when they saw power on the list of sectors for this net zero transition forum, they're like, well, isn't power sorted? Why is it interesting? So is it sorted?
No.
Why? Yeah, elaborate.
No, it isn't sorted. What may give that impression is that, as I said, the cost curves of some renewable sources have come down substantially, and we crossed a key tipping point, which is that today the cost of new traditional energy, fossil fuel-based energy, and the cost of new renewable energy have tipped. So new renewable energy in most parts of the world is cheaper than building new traditional energy. But there's many, many more important tipping points that need to be crossed. Crucially, that new renewables plus storage need to cost less than running your fossil fuel plants. By the way, at this gas prices and oil prices and gas prices, this is actually happening in several locations in the world. So let me repeat that. So in several locations in the world, today, it's cheaper to build a renewable plant, solar or wind, depending on the location, plus storage, than running a gas power or a coal power plant, which basically means that facility can replace the base load sort of role that sort of gas or coal power plant currently plays. It's a simplification. I'm an economist, bear with me. There's ancillary services, there's all sorts of issues that need to be resolved. It's not as simple as that. The grid may not be able to manage it. And that's basically why I answered no to the question, is the power sector sorted? So on the generation side, we're getting towards those tipping points, but actually getting it onto the grid and to consumers in a way that makes sense in the current market setup is not resolved. So there's an enormous amount of work that needs to be done on combining this new generation world with the demand world that Nick was describing, and it's changing substantially, and the right market tools to make all of this make sense together. And that's an enormous amount of work, because I'm afraid it's not only technologies, which engineers are very good at, but it's incentives, it's a political economy, it's winners and losers. It's business models that need to change, and that's incredibly hard.
The same question to you, but also a supplementary question, which is around the scale of the capacity deployment that we need. Does that factor in cooling appropriately and energy demand for cooling, given today, obviously?
Cooling won't be a problem in this country. It's a brave thing to say on a day like this, but largely because we have a winter-peaked electricity system, so that there should always be sufficient capacity. The amount of additional capacity we will need to meet cooling today will be really interesting to look at, but it will be a few gigawatts. It won't on the system. It won't affect the UK system. In climates where there is little or no heating demand, you're in a very different situation. It's a pity that our colleague Radhika Khosla couldn't be here. She studies cooling, particularly in the Indian context, and you can imagine there that in a country of more than 1 billion people, any expansion at all of air conditioning is potentially got huge effects. The other side of that coin is that heating in countries with significant heating loads, sort of anywhere sort of north of 40-degree latitude, I suppose, will have to be largely electrified. And for countries like the one we're sitting in, that's a much bigger challenge and will have much more profound effects for our energy system. Because if you simply just electrified everything, or the whole of heating, in a way that was sufficient for the coldest day that you might experience, say -5 everywhere, you would probably have 10 gigawatts of capacity just sitting there doing nothing most years. Well, that's, I defer to finance colleagues to think how you might arrange that, but it's clearly not a very sensible economic proposition. So that's why storage might be important, and I'm not talking here about diurnal storage, which I think will be addressed largely because electric vehicles are going to give us a lot of lithium-ion batteries you can use for diurnal storage. But interseasonal or longer-term storage, which is probably part of the hydrogen story as well. So hydrogen will have a role in energy storage for the electricity system for these longer time scales, as well as being an important fuel for things that we can't electrify. All of which adds to Matteo's conclusion that no, we certainly haven't cracked this problem yet. Yeah.
If only the banks knew, because there's a real temptation actually. You look at the power sector and say there's a really clear roadmap. The power sector is making great progress decarbonising in different regions. And when we work through other portfolios, so a particular one would be, if you look at buildings, whether that's residential or commercial properties, you start by saying, what are we going to get for free? Because the power sector's decarbonising the grid. And that's going to feed through to the lower emissions intensities for those buildings. So there's a lot of temptation to say, power generation's got this. And I think when you peel the onion, you sort of realise there's a lot of decarbonisation happening, but it's not yet 1.5 degree aligned. So when we work with banks that are setting power sector specific targets in their portfolios, and they often start there, there's a sort of a realisation point that the level of decarbonisation that's planned is only sort of taking us to maybe just below 2 if you're lucky, and depending on which grid you're looking at. And then there's a big stretch to try and align a portfolio well beyond what's planned in the grid. What I've seen in several large banks that have tackled this power portfolio question is the main way at the moment to make up the gap is to think if the bank's portfolio was representative of a 1.5 aligned mix of power generation by 2030, what would that look like? And then you've got a much larger share of renewables in that portfolio, and most of the progress is coming from that angle, leaning into renewables, as opposed to, for example, disengaging from clients that are fossil fuel generators at this stage. But I think that will come.
And Nick, just a quick follow-up, which is, have you been following the AGL demerger plan and like Cannon Brooks, and that's just a really interesting example.
Very closely.
So could you share your thoughts on that and whether it's something that's likely to succeed and be replicated?
And so we work with lots of banks globally, and we work with all sorts of power generators globally and manage conflicts. I've recently been working with a large Australian bank and sort of watched closely the case of AGL. So for those not familiar, AGL is one of the largest gentailers in Australia, which are power generators and retailers combined, so they've got both parts. Activist investors led by Cannon Brooks identified that essentially the value in that business was in the retailers' components. So they could value the whole business based on the potential for revenues from the retail business, and use that to acquire the whole business, quickly switch off, decommission the coal-powered generators much more rapidly than was currently committed by the management team, and take that whole business plan to the shareholders in a sort of aggressive corporate action. So a really exciting period recently to be looking at the power sector and working with financiers. The question for, I suppose, for a bank in that situation is, should a bank take a position? Should a bank engage? A bank doesn't own shares. So a bank doesn't necessarily have a position on that type of corporate strategy. But how does a bank continue to support its customers whilst also being aware of the sort of extreme market-driven volatility in financial planning and potential stranded asset considerations? So there's a lot happening in transition in power sector that banks need to be sensitive to.
Okay, we'll probably come back to that and talk more about it. So one other question for the panel before I open it up is around energy security and how they think, obviously, events this year with Russia-Ukraine, how that has affected transition scenarios for the power sector in Europe, but also what that means globally. How has your view changed as a result of what's happened in the last 6 months? Do you want to go?
Easy question, right?
An easy question.
To tackle a small one. Look, I would say that I feel that we're missing an opportunity a little bit, and particularly around picking up the storage story more quickly. What I would have expected Europe to say post the Russian invasion in Ukraine and foreseeing some substantial disruption on the security of the delivery of gas, and therefore on the inability to rely on some of your baseload power capabilities, I would have expected them to say two things. One, let's push as much as we possibly can on smart energy demand management, optimization of energy demand. So EV connections into the grid, optimization of timing of demand, all stuff that the technology is there, we know how to do it, it requires regulation, requires not massive capex investments, in fact. And second, I would expect them to say, let's make Europe the global leader in storage, beyond EVs, like stationary storage for power, to make the renewable assets that Europe has already invested in more valuable in a moment in which the issue is meet peak demand and meet baseload requirements. So they did a little bit on the first one, but on the second one they didn't. And I was really surprised by it. And I think the issue is, again, a geopolitical issue, that this would have meant Europe would have needed to rely primarily on China for the supply of the batteries, because the greatest majority of the manufacturing of the battery now happens in China. I don't think they were ready to do that. And, you know, I'm not smart enough to judge whether there was the right geopolitical call or not, but I suspect that was the... And while the LNG push, which they did, was a reliance on partners they could trust more, primarily the US, and to a lesser extent, the Gulf. So I suspect they made the geopolitical choice there, and I think it's incredibly short-sighted. I can say it now, I don't work for the European Bank for Reconstruction and Development anymore. I couldn't have said that then. But I think it's short-sighted because it would have really projected Europe ahead and made the renewable assets that Europe has invested in at some cost by being very early in the game, much, much more valuable overnight, because it would allow them to use those renewable assets for peak demand substitution. So that's at least how I see that.
So a missed opportunity, but do you think this will spur a more rapid decarbonisation of the power system, or will it slow it down?
So I'm curious, maybe others have other ideas, but I think it probably, you're probably right. So there was an absolute immediate need for an immediate solution. We're talking about, the plans to get rid of Russian gas by the end of the year and so on. And there I can understand how increasing the capacity to import LNG was probably the only potential solution. But I think we're talking, the storage story that I'm telling, it's not a story of 20 years. It's a story of 2-3 years. And I think taking the decision as early as possible is always too late. So in a way, it would have been a good opportunity in the short, medium term. I wouldn't even call it medium term, short, medium term, particularly combined with a demand side optimization story, again, for which Europe has a technology leadership potential. So not only a missed opportunity in terms of energy security, but really a missed opportunity of being at the forefront of technology revolutions that will, because cost curves tell us that, dominate the world for the next decades to come.
Yeah. Nick, first?
I largely agree with Matteo. I think we need to be careful about proposing that any sort of investment is a solution to a crisis that operates on weeks and months. I mean, it's a short-run crisis in the first instance. It might go on to be a long run, but if you view it as a short-run crisis, then no capital investment at all is a solution to it. Which is why options like keeping open nuclear stations, keeping open coal stations, etc., are being canvassed, and it's a hard thing for me to say, but that's probably quite a rational solution. Even on the demand side, Matteo's picked the area where you probably could do most quickly. I am sadly having to tell people who ask us how much energy efficiency can be done in the next 3 months that, well, you're asking that. That's the wrong question. The right question is how much could we have done in the last 10 years and how much could we do in the next 10 years, because it's a capital investment problem. There are some things you can do. If there's a crisis, you can turn thermostats down to 18 in winter. That saves you an awful lot of gas, actually, something like 40 terawatt hours, according to my calculations. But that's what you do in a crisis with the capital stock that you've got, and I suspect that's what we'll end up looking at this winter, rather than the more rational investment solutions that Matteo pointed to.
Yeah.
I suppose what I can add, because I probably can't add anything to the sort of geopolitical angle or the sort of power sector dynamics of investment, but from a finance sector perspective, the question we have to ask ourselves, well, it's two things. It's one of, does this geopolitical crisis change our level of ambition? Does it change what it means to align our portfolio with 1.5 degrees? And that's the first question. Does it change the achievability of that? And that's the second question. So as we're managing, finance investments, there's a balance between those two questions. I think on the first, ambition, it hasn't really changed anything about what it means to deliver 1.5. You've got a loss of energy supply from one region. That needs to be replaced somewhere, and you may or may not be able to do that, but the sort of carbon budget dynamics are fixed. So has it changed anything about the achievability then of 1.5 degrees? And it probably has, if we're honest. It means in the short term, if it's a short-term crisis, there's going to be some volatility to work through in those markets. So your clients will face valuation changes, and some of those may be positive if the oil price is going upwards. And that's going to create certain incentives which might push you off track in the near term, because people will want to invest, be encouraged to invest in that commodity price spike in the short term. But I think financial services effectively are increasingly committed to delivering a set level of ambition. So if you're a member of the Glasgow Financial Alliance for Net Zero, you're committed to 1.5, and essentially you'll need to navigate that increased volatility.
Nick, a quick follow-up, and Mattia, you might want to come in too, is interest rates. Inflationary period, interest rates are rising. How is that affecting interest in investments in renewables in particular?
Well, I mean, we saw that at the beginning of the year. Our renewable stocks took a big hit, primarily because there was a shift from growth to value. Markets are very 0-1 on this stuff. So there was a market shift between growth and value, which means that investors sort of prefer to put their money in stocks that produce revenues now as opposed to revenues in the future. And those tend to be value stocks. Why do they do that? Because they have higher interest rates. They put it into that valuation machinery, and any company that has revenues far in the future, of course, it's discounted more, so the valuation comes down compared to companies that have revenues today, immediately. So that hit a lot of companies, renewables to an extent, but many companies that were in the tech space around the transition to low carbon associated with renewables. Well, believe it or not, after every growth to value turn, there is a value to growth turn afterwards. And it's just a matter of how the interest rate and inflation story will be navigated at sort of a monetary policy perspective, whether markets will perceive that the risks of sort of a recession or a sort of overreaction of central banks implies higher interest rate for a longer period of time. My thinking is that looking at markets more recently, I think I don't want to talk out to source, and other people I see there's Bank of England people in the room, so I speak under their control. But the impression I have is that markets are perceiving that a recession is perhaps less likely than it was thought a couple of months ago. And there's a sense that central banks are reacting quickly, and that they're certainly, remember, it's the first time we experienced inflation in 20 years, and of scale. So it was really a test on how much better has monetary policy become, and I think they're passing the test, and the impression is that the key banks have reacted swiftly. So the impression I have is that the turn back to growth may be closer than we think.
Particularly optimistic.
I know.
I love it, it's great. Nick, do you want to
Give an optimistic take on it as well, actually, but from a bank perspective, so if that's sort of more of a investment perspective and a markets perspective, the economics for a bank is essentially net interest margin, primarily if you're in a lending relationship. And actually increasing interest rate environments is generally good for net interest margins. You're able to charge your borrowers a lot more, and because you borrow money cheaply or for free from retail depositors, that increases the margins you can make. So what relevance to the power sector? When you look at investing in renewables or lending to renewables for a bank, often the resistance is around the margins that are available. There's a view that there's a lot of competition in that space across banks that want to lend to renewables, and as a result, margins tend to be really fine. So for me, the unwinding of margin compression is a really positive story for the ability of banks to actually make a return in a sector that's otherwise got really compressed yields.
Great, okay. Questions from the audience? Yes. So lady in green down here, and then gentleman at the front.
Hi, my name is Sharifa. I'm from Malaysia. Thank you so much to the panel for a very, very balanced discussion. My question is that I think from morning until now, especially on this power side, we've had a lot of focus on the E element. The S and the G is something that I'm very, very keen to know about also what you think. So from a power perspective, a lot of power produced in Asia is coal generated, but it actually keeps people warm. It feeds people, and if there is a transition, a lot of people may lose jobs, livelihoods. So the S factor, how do we balance that? Thank you.
Great question. Could you pass it down to the front? Cool. over to you.
Thank you. Apologies if this is outside your remit, but Nick, when he showed us his slide, did talk about the global investment needed for the electricity transition. So my question is, how does this work in a country like Nigeria, where 50% of the population still doesn't have access to electricity, where 60 to 80% of the population uses biomass for cooking, where the electricity infrastructure is either undeveloped or doesn't work, etc.?
Okay, so two big questions. One about the just transition, and I'm thinking particularly in emerging economies, large emerging economies, how you handle that, and then energy access. Who wants to go?
I can go on the S first, because I'll probably skip the other question and pass on that one. But on the S and this just transition, maybe two perspectives, one sort of macro and one's going down to the individual company level. So first of all, when you look at a report like the IEA's report on net zero, implicit in some of those regional pathways is the understanding of certain regions are going faster on decarbonisation and some are going slower. And so when we look at demand for, certain transition fuels or demand for electrification in certain regions, certain economies are being asked to go a lot faster. And then that's cascading down into how we look at portfolios when we're financing, considering not applying global pathways to any financing portfolio, but really being specific about what's the scope of that portfolio, what are the companies and the regional context there, and how would you make sure that the level of ambition, or the level of ask within that sector is appropriately balanced to the share that it needs to make, the just share, compared to other regions. So that's something when we work with banks on their portfolio setting, we're carefully thinking about not just taking the easiest, slowest pathway, but thinking carefully about making sure the ambition is appropriately set so that it is 1.5 aligned, but on the basis of that particular portfolio doing its fair share of decarbonisation. That's the sort of first maybe macro perspective, and hopefully I've got that right, because I'm not, as I say, an expert in some of these sectors. But the other, if you take that down to a sort of what does that mean for an individual company, and a bank or an investor might be engaging with a certain power generator, and as it engages with that company, needs to consider not just does it have a plan that's 1.5 degree aligned, but does that plan consider some of the unintended effects, and is there a wider package that's being put in place that treats everyone fairly, serves the communities, and is just in that sense. Maybe just to give a really specific example, because some of that's high level, maybe going back to AGL, because I think it's a really interesting example in Australia. What the management team there tried to do is put forward a transition plan that had built in with it the concept of, yes, switching off coal-fired generators and having a schedule for that, but at the same time looking to build out the concept of a renewable energy hub around those particular generators, so that in another sort of, whether it was a decade's time or probably too late, there was a plan in place that there would be industry there, and the local communities and the staff would have jobs to go to, switching from a coal generator to other industries locally.
Either of you want to come on?
Yeah, I mean, I agree with everything that Nick has said. There are always going to be short-term issues in the nature of a transition is that there are some winners and some losers. So it's the total package that matters. Clearly, people who mine coal in Asian countries are going to lose their jobs in an energy transition. There's no way of dodging that, and we've seen that in many European countries with serious social consequences in some cases. So it is a case of putting the package in place. On the bigger picture and the second question in particular, the sorts of price changes that Matteo summarised in his talk allow us to electrify rural areas we're talking sub-Saharan Africa and South Asia, essentially, much, much cheaper than the traditional idea of building a giant oil-fired power station on the coast and a massive transmission line, etc. This is not the way those places are now going to be electrified. So actually, it's one of the few areas, I think, where the E, the S, and the G are pretty much aligned because, let's be clear about it, the corruption and inefficiency in traditional electricity utilities in many countries has been a serious problem. We ought to be able to do better with more localised systems.
Nick, you made a point which is so important, which is a response to your question about the S. We have to be careful about that, and we have to accompany and support the losers. But at the same time, we can't do that at the expense of not making use of the leapfrogging opportunities for emerging markets. And we are talking about value-added opportunities, which will be unique in a generation. So you cannot leave them behind. You cannot have another transition in which emerging developing countries are left behind. You want them to be upfront and really make sure that they benefit and leapfrog away from having to build, a central fossil fuel-based generation plant on the coast, which is subject to capture, as Nick described. So definitely, let's think about it in that context.
And so much of that context is about state-owned enterprises. And I don't think we've got any. Do we have any SOEs here? We do. We have one, don't we? Malaysia. But that's an area where we do quite a lot of work across Oxford on SOEs. Okay, other questions? Yes, great. Those two. So Dominic first.
What do you view as the best solution to the challenge of intermittency with renewables? Nuclear, perhaps battery, storage, hydrogen, or fossil fuels plus carbon capture, usage and storage?
If you could also just say who you are and your affiliation.
Dominic Tai from Lombard Odier.
Hi, my name is Albena. I work for Octopus Energy and I'm part-time seconded to the UN. A banking question. It's not really my sector, but I read quite a deflating reports earlier this year about big tech's cash being held in banks and how that is potentially largely fueling the fossil economy still. And they talk about scope 3 emissions and those not being reported. It's really great to hear that, about your work with banks to keep 1.5 alive and having portfolios that are aligned with that. But my question is, how do we keep more banks accountable and ask this question of where that cash that's held there is going? Because it's very clear that we shouldn't have any more fossil fuel expansion, and they are still financing it, largely using big tech money. So is there a silver lining or a positive scenario where we stop using big tech or anyone's cash really to finance big oil?
So I think that's definitely a question for Nick Tracy. And that's a report from the Climate Safe Lending Network, I think. And James Vaccaro, who runs it, will be here tomorrow. But Nick, do you want to address that directly? And then
yeah, sure, I'll take that one. Just in general terms. So, and first of all, I think banks generally have a very fungible balance sheet. So I do believe it's cash in general terms, wherever the source of that is then funding assets on the balance sheet, which for a bank are largely loans, but also revolving credit facilities and on-demand facilities. So there is that sort of fungibility, which is the first point to make. You will never trace cash through to a specific asset. That's not necessarily how it works. But I think the important thing is to look at the asset side of the balance sheet and be really transparent for banks to say, this is a composition of our balance sheet. This is where we've got exposure to high-emitting sectors. And to just be really clear of that breakdown. It will take time for them to decarbonise all of those portfolios. And that's what GFANZ and NZBA is providing a framework for them to do. They are required to address all high-emitting sectors within the portfolio, set targets for those within a specific period of time after making that commitment to be part of NZBA. And what you see as a result is usually not just the exposure that a bank has to those sectors, but what's the financed emissions? So what's the bank's share of the financing and therefore the bank's share of the emissions? It's that transparency, I think, on the asset side of the balance sheet that's going to be really important to then track progress and hold banks to account over time.
Do either of you want to come in on the...
Yeah, I can on the intermittency question. Intermittency or variability, you normally tell which side of the argument's on from which word they use, actually, which is quite... I'm not suggesting you're on one side of the argument, but just be aware of that. That people who think it's not so much of a problem call it variability. The short answer is you need other flexible resources on the system. Now, they can be flexible demand, so you can switch on and off and different uses, and that's IT is, of course, improving our ability to do that. You can have storage, which I suspect will be most of the answer, because we will have large amounts of storage in vehicles that allows us to address that diurnally. The worst thing you can do is put other inflexible power generation resources onto the system. And the two that I would name would be nuclear, and I should declare an interest. I am a nuclear physicist. I did work for the UK Atomic Energy Authority, which means I can say safely it's about the worst thing you can do to address the inflexibility of renewables. And I think there are questions about fossil with CCS because they're likely to be less flexible than just fossil plants, because they're essentially a fossil fuel powered station with a chemical factory on the back end, and so they're likely to be less flexible than, say, a traditional gas-fired generator.
Naive question. Some of the strong decarbonisation 1.5 degree scenarios anticipate, for example, hydrogen being an important alternative energy carrier, and also a source of demand for electricity if it's green hydrogen. Is there a scenario where your flexibility, if you have oversupply of renewables, your variability can go into variable generation of those energy carriers like hydrogen? Can we flex our industrial processes as opposed to having storage? Naive question. Apologies.
I mean, I think these are questions to be answered in the latter stages of the transition, because these will be the last things that get decarbonised. But we will soon, in many countries, be into a position where we have excess renewables. We like to have excess renewables before we have shortages because of renewables, and that's where the hydrogen story, or the green hydrogen story, begins. And then there's a lot of debate then about what is the cost of hydrogen, because, as was said this morning, it's mainly an electricity cost, but if the electricity cost is free at the margin, then green hydrogen in principle can be quite cheap. But these are quite complicated questions to answer. We will definitely need hydrogen for the hard to electrify processes. We might be able to use some in power generation to when we've got say wind deficits, but probably the main uses of hydrogen will not be in the power system. But it would be sensible, I think, to keep some hydrogen being a gas-fired generators in place on the system to use hydrogen in the long term, particularly in countries reliant on wind, where you can get droughts of, say, of order a week.
It is actually, the hydrogen question is a very interesting question, and I don't think we have a clear answer, partially because we don't have full sight on how cost curves will behave, particularly in the renewable and storage space. If indeed I'm right, and renewable and storage will mean zero marginal cost electricity, then yes, that opens the way for very cheap hydrogen, but at the time it makes you wonder, do we actually need hydrogen? If you can overbuild renewables so much that even when you are in demand for power and the sun is very, very light and the wind is very, very light, you have sufficient renewables to meet demand together with some storage, you may actually not need that much seasonal storage. So it's really, I don't think the answer is clear. What I'm worried about is that in Brussels, for sure, and increasingly in Washington, they think the answer is clear. And they think there's a very important role for hydrogen, for power. I have some question marks on that. I think I can see some inevitable need for decarbonizing industrial processes, no doubt. But the scale of hydrogen you would need to decarbonize industrial processes is minuscule compared to the scale of hydrogen you would need for a full seasonal storage system in the absence of an overbuild of renewables and storage. So unless we are able to answer this question, I don't think we can answer very clearly the hydrogen story. By the way, this has very important implication for investments, because if you follow the markets until mid last year, anything hydrogen was skyrocketed in valuations on the expectations that there would be enormous upfront investments to meet both the industry and the power need for hydrogen, particularly in Europe and to an extent in the US. Those valuations have gone back to normal, mostly because of interest rate, not because they think I'm right. But nonetheless, it'd be an interesting space to watch.
And if you want tips on hydrogen investing, you can contact our Lombard Odier colleagues later. But we've got three questions. Mike there, and then Patrizio, I'm sorry, you're going to go up. And then the gentleman there, who I can't really make out, and then Christoph up there.
Is that on?
Yeah.
So Mike, this is a banks acceleration question. There are sort of two views on banks. If you're an NGO, you probably say they're the rascals in the room. They're trying to hide behind inappropriate transition scenarios to the IA. If you're NISBA, because I was with Remco Fischer the other day chairing a session representing Net Zero Banking Alliance, it's the stringest set of targets across the whole net zero children's family. So I think I'm going to have to ask you to assume, Nick, and the panelists don't have this problem, that tomorrow you've sort of resigned from advising banks and you've got, the three of you, half an hour with the chairs of the net zero asset owner members, and you're advising them how to accelerate the banks. You know, where are the weak points? Where's their reputation at risk? What actions, investment managers can do so much, but they're limited. The asset owners have got the power. What would you want asset owners to be asking their investment managers to do to accelerate the change? Because if we look at the sort of bullish statements from the chief executive of JP Morgan, if we even look at...
Got the gist of the question, sorry.
Okay. Well, the question is, what would the advice be? Yeah.
Yeah.
Hi, it's Seth Kirkham from Galvanise. Just related to the last answer, actually, I just wonder when you think the merit order will no longer be the appropriate mechanism to price electricity, given we are in many European countries already facing days when energy prices are negative and if not zero, and being dumped into holes in Hungary, I think. And so are bankers thinking about that in terms of their funding models, because these are multi-decade assets, and from a sort of regulatory construct, how close are we to figuring out another way to introduce capacity payments or energy as a service?
Pretty good question. And then Christoph over there, guy in blue shirt.
Thank you. Christoph Nedepil from Fudan University in Shanghai. Elephant in the room is, of course, coal-fired power plants in Asia that tend to be very young. And I'm very curious about any form of potential energy transition, coal phase out, from an asset owner perspective or financial institution perspective that holds all the assets without, and who's incurring all the losses if you really do the green transition, and whether you guys have any good solution for that.
Another great question. So we've got a question on structures for phasing out coal-fired power stations. We've got a question on advice to Net Zero Banking Alliance and banks. And then a question, which I'm going to elaborate on, the final question, which is about kind of electricity markets and changes in electricity markets, which obviously then underpin the investment case in this area. In the UK, a consultation was just published, I think yesterday, Nick, on the review of electricity market arrangements. Wonderful bedtime reading. I must admit, I haven't read it either. But particularly you, Nick Eyre and Mattia, if you could sort of, and you also mentioned at the beginning electricity markets and reform of electricity markets, could you say a bit about how you think that's going to develop, what needs to change? Because this is a super interesting area. So I don't know who wants to go first. I'm relaxed.
I'll have a go.
Yeah.
So is the merit order system broken? Probably, and certainly will be. I mean, how on earth can you operate on a merit order system when the short-run marginal cost of everything on the system is approximately zero? It's sort of obvious, isn't it? So the cost structure is fundamentally different. It's a capital cost structure and it's a flexibility cost structure. So that's what the review, I hope, when I read the UK consultation, I hope that's the sort of starting point. And the question is then, how do we make it work? I'm not an economist, so I'm not going to try and answer that question. But the answer to your question is it broken? Is yes.
And I'm very jealous of Nick because he's of course a physicist, and as you know, all economists are failed physicists. So physicists can answer questions about economics, but economists can certainly not answer questions around physics. I can try on markets, although I don't have a solution. But I just want to make one point. I mean, the UK has actually it's been incredibly progressive, and it's capacity markets were created here. There's been real, very, very impressive public policy tests on market structures. Some of them have worked and have informed market structure all over the world. So this is changing, and we're going to see these changes. I don't know if you follow the debate in Europe, but this is very live debate, and I'm quite sure that Brussels will come up with some solutions. There's already come up with some solutions. But I just want to make a general point, which is we have to stop thinking in terms of generation, transmission, distribution, and end use as being separate. They're not. The world we're going into is a world of prosumers, of producer and consumers. It'd be a world in which the services provided to the energy system will come from all of these three actors together. It'll be combined, and they'll come at different times and moments. And all of them will need to be incentivized and rewarded for those services. And that's really the direction of travel. Now, what that means in practice, I can't tell you, but I can certainly tell you that a sort of marginal cost of power pricing model as we currently have it is not going to do that.
Tracy, do you want to come in?
Respond on that particular question, I probably couldn't. But on the other question on NZBA and the Asset Owners Alliance, and what would be our advice in terms of making that more progressive? And actually, the former co-chair of NZBA, Simon Connell, has just recently joined Baringa Partners last week, and so I'll need to kind of confer and check my answer with him when I'm back in the office later in the week. But I would say two things. First of all is actually the alignment between the banking sector, asset owners and asset managers. So at the moment, it seems to me, but I might have a biased view from the banking perspective, banks have been asked to set targets for all high-emitting sectors within 36 months. It's quite an accelerated timeline already, 18 to 36 months. There's some conditionality around that. And so that's a very accelerated timetable for a bank to make commitments on behalf of all of its customers across those sectors, where it has no voting power, and actually the relationships tend to be, much more illiquid, and it's not possible to just sever most banking relationships without incurring credit losses over that sort of horizon. So it's a really big ask for banks. So asset managers tend to be targeting portfolio coverage of most of their portfolio, but where the portfolio coverage targets tend to be quite long range. So by 2030, you want all of your portfolio companies to have net zero aligned targets, which, and we can sort of debate if that's as ambitious. I'm sure it's still a big challenge, but I think that there could be an alignment between the horizon over which we're trying to sort of drive progress across the financial sector is maybe the first point. The second one would be around engagement. So assessing the transition plans of those companies, either that have a banking relationship or are your investees. And engagement means a different thing for a bank versus an investor, but there's definitely an opportunity for more alignment there, and perhaps a coming together of banks and investors to work through that process. I think GFANZ is really helpful because it, for the first time, brings together all of those separate alliances that existed previously. So you've got asset owners, managers, and banks all now under one roof. And just recently, GFANZ published their sort of umbrella guidance, which starts to drive some of that consistency. And I think we'll get even more of that consistency coming through over the next, but I'm looking at others here who might know more. I'm sure we'll just continue to drive that consistency across the financial sector.
Great. Well, we're out of time, so join me in thanking our wonderful panel, and of course, Karina's not here.